Hi everyone. Today, Hidden Nightmares postcard brings you the story, The Ghost Ship of the North Sea. If you enjoy this video, please give it a like, leave a comment, share it with your friends, and don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads. The North Sea has always kept its secrets. For centuries, ships disappeared in the endless fog, their names fading from shipping logs and memory. But even among the old-timers in the docks of Lerwick, there was one story that nobody told after dark, one that sent chills down your spine if you ever heard it whispered over a cup of black coffee or a late-night whiskey. They called it the legend of the Ægir's embrace, the ghost ship that haunted waters no living sailor wanted to cross. It all started, like most of these stories do, on a night nobody expected. October 17, 1979, out at sea, heavy clouds sagged close to the waves, and the wind whipped the water into a constant, angry chop. The trawler Hildegard was fighting her way north. She was an old, salty boat, paint peeling, engine rumbling, nets weighed down with the night's catch. At the helm was Captain Magnus Sorensen, a man with squint lines etched into his face from a lifetime of storms. Magnus didn't believe in ghost stories. He believed in broken radios, rusted bolts, and the bad luck of running out of whiskey before the end of a trip. But ghosts? Never. That is, until the radio started to scream. It was a little after 2 a.m. Most of the Hildegard's crew were below deck, eating cold meat pies and trading stories, when suddenly the radio burst into life, a harsh, chilling static that shattered the silence. Over the noise, a woman's voice came through, thin, distorted, desperate. All hands lost, drifting, don't come. The radio operator, Tomas, dropped his fork, the clatter echoing in the tight mess hall. Magnus, hearing the commotion, hurried into the radio shack. The signal was faint, buried in static, like someone shouting from the eye of a hurricane. Tomas fiddled with the dials, hands shaking, trying to tune it in. Repeat, this is the Hildegard, give us your position, come in, over. Only silence followed, an awful, empty silence. Then, like someone sobbing into a well, the voice returned. North by northeast, ship is lost, the sea won't let us go. Please, God, don't come. Magnus felt a cold chill run down his spine. Sure, ships got in trouble all the time out here, but there was something in her voice, a deadness, a sense of surrender, like she already knew no help was coming. The crew was dead quiet. No one said it out loud, but they all felt the same thing. This wasn't a distress call. This was a warning. Magnus made the call. He'd seen too many men lost because they hesitated. He ordered the Hildegard to turn north-northeast, pushing into the thickest fog he'd ever seen. The deck lights flickered, and it almost felt like the ocean itself was humming, waiting for them to break some old, unspoken rule. Hours passed as they crawled forward, radar spinning uselessly, compass acting crazy. The only sounds were the slap of cold waves and, every once in a while, that same woman's voice, drifting in and out, drifting. The light. Don't look at the light. All hands lost. At 4:17 a.m., the fog suddenly opened like curtains. And there she was, the ship. She floated motionless, almost like she wasn't even touching the water. There was no name on her bow. The hull was scorched black. The decks covered in a crust of ice even though it wasn't cold. Every porthole glowed with a weird blue-white light, and the ropes and rigging creaked and shifted, even though there was no wind. It was like looking at something from a nightmare, something that wasn't supposed to exist. The Hildegard's engine sputtered and died. Tomas whispered a prayer in Norwegian. Even the ocean seemed to go completely still. Magnus grabbed his binoculars and stared across the water. He saw shadows, figures, moving along the other ship's railing. Their faces were gray and hollow, mouths open in a silent scream. And then, one by one, those faces turned and looked straight at him. He felt their stare like a cold hand around his heart. Suddenly, the radio snapped to life again. Leave, leave, she is awake. The lights on the ghost ship flickered, grew so bright they hurt his eyes. Magnus stumbled back, blinking, and when he looked again, the ship was gone. The sea was empty, silent, like nothing had ever been there. But nothing felt the same on the Hildegard after that. The crew started whispering, Tomas wouldn't touch the radio anymore. The nets came up empty. Even the fog stuck around. Days longer than it should have. Magnus knew deep down that this was just the beginning. He'd stared into the face of the Ægir's embrace, and it had stared right back. Somewhere out there, lost in the endless North Sea, the ghost ship was still sailing, searching for something, or someone, to drag down with her. And on those long, sleepless nights, when the wind screamed and the fog pressed against the windows, Magnus could still hear that voice on the radio, soft and lost as ever. Don't look at the light. All hands lost. Don't come. He wondered if, next time, he'd listen. After the ghost ship vanished, an uneasy quiet settled over the Hildegard. The engine coughed to life again. But it sounded sick, and nobody trusted it. The crew moved around the deck in nervous silence, every step echoing in the mist. The sun came up pale and cold, doing nothing to shake off the night's chill. Nobody mentioned what they'd seen. Instead, they busied themselves with pointless chores, mending nets that didn't need mending, checking bolts and hatches that were already secure. Every so often, one of the men would glance back at the horizon, half expecting to see that blue light glowing out in the fog. Magnus couldn't get the woman's voice out of his head. The way she said, "Don't come," kept replaying, over and over, like some kind of curse. He found himself staring at the radio, waiting for it to come alive again. But all he heard was the normal hum of static, broken only by the crackle of distant weather updates. It wasn't until noon that they found the driftwood. Eric, the youngest deckhand, was hauling in a section of net when he shouted for help. Tangled up in the mesh was a piece of wood, old, waterlogged, covered in strange barnacles and strips of black seaweed. It looked like it had been underwater for 100 years. Maybe more. As Magnus and Tomas helped haul it onto the deck, they realized it wasn't just wood. There were carvings along one edge, runes that looked ancient and ugly, like someone had hacked them out with a knife in the dark. Tomas stared at the markings, his face going pale. "It's Old Norse," he muttered. "I think it says, 'The drowned do not rest.'" No one spoke for a long moment. Then Magnus ordered the crew to throw the driftwood back into the sea. But as they tossed it overboard, Eric swore he heard a woman crying, muffled and far away. The day dragged on. Not a single fish got caught in their nets. The radio stayed eerily quiet. By late afternoon, Magnus started feeling like the Hildegard was stuck in a loop, moving through the same fog, circling the same patch of dead water, over and over. The sun barely moved. When night finally came, the fog got even thicker, pressing against the windows, swallowing the deck lights in a wall of white. Down below, the men tried to sleep, but the ship felt different, colder, almost like it was moving through something alive. Magnus lay awake in his tiny cabin, listening to every creak and groan of the hull. Around midnight, he heard something new, a slow, dragging sound along the side of the ship, like someone running their fingers over the planks. He held his breath, heart thudding, but it faded as suddenly as it had come. Then, just before dawn, the radio came to life. At first, it was only static, but then he heard it, the same woman's voice, whispering in a broken, hopeless way. "All hands lost, drifting, don't look at the light." Magnus reached for the radio mic, but his hands shook too much to press the button. Tomas, who had been standing in the doorway, shook his head. "Don't answer," he whispered. Magnus nodded, letting go of the mic. The voice faded, leaving only the static. Sunrise was just a lighter shade of gray. The sea was flat and silent. No wind, no birds, nothing but the endless, rolling fog. The men were jumpy, barely talking to each other, every sound making them flinch. Then, just before lunch, the nets snagged again. This time, what they pulled up made even Magnus go cold. It was a life jacket, old, torn, but with a name stitched in faded thread. Ægir's embrace. Tomas stared at it, eyes wide. "That's her. That's the ghost ship." No one wanted to touch the life jacket. They left it on deck, like a bad omen, and nobody dared throw it overboard. All afternoon, Magnus scanned the fog, his skin crawling. He could feel something out there, watching, waiting. When the sun finally set, the mist glowed with that strange, blue-white light. That night, nobody slept, and as the Hildegard drifted, lost in the heart of the North Sea. Magnus realized that once you'd seen the ghost ship, nothing could ever bring you home again. No one on the Hildegard had slept. Every time someone started to doze off, there'd be a sharp bang on the hull or the faint sound of footsteps on the deck. Even the air felt heavier, sticky with fog and the scent of salt and rust. When Magnus stepped outside at first light, the deck was slick with dew and the fog was thicker than ever. He could barely see from bow to stern. The life jacket still sat where they'd left it. Nobody wanted to touch it. Eric kept staring at the faded letters. Ægir's embrace. The name was almost a dare, a challenge to fate. All day, the crew avoided that side of the deck, pretending to work but glancing over their shoulders every few seconds. The radio stayed silent. Even the gulls had disappeared. Magnus tried to hold the crew together, but he felt the same as them, lost, uneasy, like a trespasser. He found himself drawn to the life jacket, studying the waterlogged cloth and torn seams. He wondered about the person who'd worn it. Had they tried to swim for shore, only to vanish like everyone else from the ghost ship? He shivered, turning away. Just after noon, something changed. The fog, instead of lifting with the sun, started to glow, a pale blue light, faint at first but quickly growing brighter, like a lantern underwater. The air buzzed with electricity. The hairs on Magnus's arms stood on end. It was the same light he'd seen through the ghost ship's portholes. That otherworldly blue-white that looked cold even from a distance. "Captain," Tomas called from the bridge. "Come quick." Magnus ran up, heart racing. Tomas pointed at the radar screen. It was blank one moment, then filled with static, and then, there, a single, solid blip, dead ahead, too close for comfort. Magnus looked up, squinting into the glowing mist. He saw it. A dark shape, larger than the Hildegard, gliding through the fog, silent as a shadow. The blue lights shimmered along its hull, moving like living things. Shapes moved on the deck, figures dressed in rags, faces gray and lost, eyes wide and empty. The ghost ship. It didn't make a sound. It didn't need to. The Hildegard seemed to slow on her own, the engine grumbling down to a crawl, as if the ship itself was afraid. The crew clustered together at the railing, staring in horror. Someone started praying under his breath. The ghost ship drifted closer, so near Magnus could see the names scratched into the wood of its bow, hundreds of them, barely visible beneath the ice and barnacles. He realized they weren't just names. They were warnings. Suddenly, a woman's figure stepped to the front of the ghost ship. She wore a shredded coat, hair clinging to her face, her eyes hollow and dark. She raised her arm, pointing directly at the Hildegard. All at once, every porthole on the ghost ship flared with blue light. The water between the two ships began to boil and churn, as if something massive was rising from below. The radio in Tomas's hand squealed. That same desperate voice came through, warped and echoing. "Don't look at the light, don't look at the light." But it was too late. Eric, frozen in place, stared directly at the brightest porthole. His body went rigid, his eyes wide with terror. "Eric," Magnus shouted, grabbing the boy's shoulder, trying to break the trance. Eric's mouth opened in a silent scream. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the blue light blinked out. The ghost ship faded into the mist. The boiling water calmed, but Eric collapsed onto the deck, trembling and cold as ice. His eyes were unfocused, and when he finally spoke, his voice was a dry whisper. She's coming for us. She knows our names." For a moment, nobody moved. Then Tomas grabbed the life jacket and hurled it into the sea, as far as he could. It landed with a splash and was gone. The silence after was thick and final. The crew pulled Eric below and tried to warm him, but he kept muttering to himself, repeating the same phrase. "She knows our names, she knows our names." The Hildegard drifted, engines idling, caught in the ghost ship's wake. The fog pressed close again, thicker and colder than before. Magnus stared out at the empty, haunted sea and realized he'd made a terrible mistake turning into the fog that night. He wasn't sure if they'd ever find their way back. The fog wouldn't lift. By the next morning, it was thicker than ever, swallowing every sound, every shaft of sunlight. It felt as if the Hildegard was drifting inside a snow globe, sealed off from the rest of the world. Cut loose from reality, the ocean was still as glass. There was no wind, no waves, only that endless gray. Inside, the mood was even worse. Eric hadn't said a word since the night before. He lay in his bunk, shivering, his eyes darting around the cabin like he was seeing something the others couldn't. Sometimes he'd flinch and whisper, "She's out there," over and over. Nobody tried to comfort him. They were all too scared. Magnus found himself pacing the deck, searching for answers that didn't exist. His mind raced with questions. Was the ghost ship following them? Or were they following it? Did it even matter anymore? He felt like prey, chased by something patient, something ancient, that had all the time in the world. Tomas was glued to the radio, trying every frequency, desperate for any contact. Coast Guard, another trawler, anything normal, but all he ever got was static in. Every so often, the faint echo of that woman's voice. All hands lost. Don't look at the light. Drifting. Drifting. By late afternoon, the tension broke. The nets snagged on something heavy. The crew rushed to help, grateful for the distraction, but when they hauled up the catch, their relief vanished. It wasn't fish. It was a mess of rotting ropes and splintered wood, all tangled together with ancient, rusted chains. Clinging to the debris was a tattered oilskin coat, slick and black with seawater. Magnus stared at it, recognizing it immediately. It was the same coat the woman on the ghost ship had worn. Nobody dared touch it, but as the bundle hit the deck, water spilled out, and with it, a chorus of low whispers, like a dozen voices overlapping in the mist. At first, they were too soft to make out, but then the words sharpened, slicing through the fear. "Come down, join us, it's so cold, we're waiting." The whispers faded, but the chill remained. The crew backed away, crossing themselves, muttering prayers in Norwegian, English, any language they could remember. Magnus forced himself forward. He prodded the coat with an oar, turning it over. Inside the lining, scrawled in black, was a list of names. Some were faded, some freshly written, as if someone had been adding to the tally even after death. At the very bottom was a name that made Magnus's blood run cold. Magnus Sorensen, his own name. His hands shook as he pulled away. Someone screamed below deck, "Eric," his voice raw with terror. Magnus rushed down and found the young man pressed against the porthole, eyes wide, pointing out into the fog. "She's right there," Eric cried. "She's calling to me. She wants us all. She wants you." "Captain." Magnus tried to pull Eric away, but the boy clung to the glass, whispering nonsense. For a second, Magnus glanced outside, and saw a face looking in, pale and empty, eyes like deep-sea voids. He staggered back, his skin crawling. The crew locked all the doors, barricaded every hatch, but it felt pointless. The fog pressed in tighter, and the Hildegard rocked as if something huge was circling just beneath the surface. That night, the whispers got louder. Every time Magnus closed his eyes, he heard them, voices rising up from the ocean, repeating the same message, join us, all hands lost." By midnight, the crew was huddled together in the galley, weapons in hand, an axe, a flare gun, anything to fight off whatever was coming. Magnus tried to steady his voice. "We stick together," he said, "no matter what." But as the ship creaked and the mist thickened, they all felt it. Something was coming for them. It was only a matter of time. The night seemed endless. The fog pressed against the Hildegard so thick that the deck lights became useless, just faint halos swallowed by the gray. The ship felt smaller with every passing hour, as if the North Sea itself was squeezing it in a giant, unseen fist. Sleep was impossible. The whispers grew louder, crawling through the steel walls, rattling through the vents. Sometimes, Magnus would catch a cold draft swirling around his feet, even with every hatch locked tight. Each time his eyes closed, he saw the pale face outside the porthole, lips moving in slow, silent warning. Sometime past 3 in the morning, the temperature dropped even lower. A heavy thud rocked the Hildegard, shaking plates and pans loose in the galley. Everyone jolted awake. It sounded like something massive had brushed against the hull, something alive. Tomas, clutching the flare gun, glanced at Magnus. "We need to get out of here. Full speed. Whatever direction. Just go." Magnus nodded. "Eric, engine room, now. Start her up. Full throttle." But Eric was gone. Panic rippled through the crew as they searched the cramped corridors. The cold air led them to the stern, where the loading ramp gaped open. Magnus's heart plummeted. Out on the wet deck, Eric stood alone, shirtless in the cold, eyes glazed and unfocused. "Eric!" Magnus yelled, fighting to reach him. But Eric didn't seem to hear. He stepped to the edge, staring straight into the fog. The others reached him just as he began to lean over the rail. Arms stretched wide, as if welcoming something only he could see. From out in the mist, the blue lights bloomed, glowing shapes moving just beneath the surface. Swirling in hypnotic patterns, the water hissed and bubbled. For a split second, Magnus saw hands, gray, bloated, webbed, rise from the sea, reaching up for Eric. No, Magnus lunged, grabbing Eric's arm. Tomas and another crewman piled on, wrestling him back from the edge. As soon as Eric hit the deck, the lights vanished. The water went still. They hauled Eric below. He was freezing, barely breathing, whispering over and over, "She called me. She called me." I had to answer. Something changed in that moment. The crew, shaken and exhausted, turned desperate. "We need to fight back," Tomas said, eyes wild. "Salt, iron, anything, old sailor tricks." They raided the galley for salt, scattered it at the doors and windows. They tied iron wrenches and crowbars to the railings, repeating superstitious rituals none of them would have believed 2 days before. Magnus, exhausted and desperate, joined in. Anything was better than waiting. The radio crackled again, first with static, then with the woman's voice. Now closer than ever. "Don't look at the light. The sea is hungry. She knows you're here." At sunrise, the fog finally began to thin. Just a little, but nobody dared celebrate. Beneath the hull, they heard scraping sounds, like nails dragging along the steel, circling the ship. Every so often, they caught a glimpse, blue-white shapes flitting beneath the surface. Just out of reach, watching, Magnus forced himself to the bridge, gripping the wheel with white-knuckled hands. "We keep moving. We don't stop, no matter what." As the Hildegard inched forward, the fog peeled back in patches, revealing an ocean that looked wrong, too smooth, too glassy, almost like a mirror, reflected in its surface. Magnus sometimes saw faces, pale and screaming, just beneath the water. He tried not to look. That afternoon, as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm them, the ghost ship appeared one last time, looming directly ahead, closer than ever before. She was beautiful and terrible, wreathed in mist, every porthole blazing with blue fire. The crew stood frozen as the Ægir's embrace drifted alongside the Hildegard. Hulls nearly touching, 100 hands reached out from her decks, beckoning, inviting, demanding. The woman stood at the prow again, her eyes burning into Magnus. "You don't belong here." Her voice boomed through the radio and across the waves, louder than thunder. "Leave this place, or be claimed by the deep." For a heartbeat, Magnus couldn't breathe. Then he slammed the throttle, pushing the Hildegard's engines past redline. The trawler roared and lurched ahead, scraping past the ghost ship, tearing through the last veil of fog. Suddenly, the blue lights vanished. The sea went dark and empty. For the first time in days, sunlight spilled over the deck. Behind them, nothing but open water. The Ægir's embrace was gone. The crew collapsed, sobbing and shaking. Magnus steered on, never looking back. But even as the sun warmed their faces and the world seemed normal again, nobody could forget the voices, the hands, the warning. And late that night, as Magnus drifted into an uneasy sleep, he heard one last whisper, echoing through the hull, soft, cold, and patient. "We'll be waiting." They should have felt relief as the Hildegard plowed through the last wisps of fog and into open water. But no one on board felt saved. The sun was bright, the air a little warmer, but the tension hung over the deck like a shroud. For a while, the men busied themselves checking the engines, the nets, the radios, anything to anchor them back to normal life. Eric was the worst. He hardly spoke, barely ate. He kept glancing over his shoulder as if he expected the sea itself to reach up and drag him away. Magnus tried to reassure him, tried to reassure them all, but the words felt empty. The ocean stretched in every direction, blue and vast, but now it seemed like a prison. They kept the ship pointed south, pushing toward home, but the radio never worked right again. Static filled every channel, and every so often, beneath the hiss, that woman's voice would drift through. All hands lost. Don't look at the light, we'll be waiting. One afternoon, Tomas tried to smash the radio with a wrench. He managed to dent the casing, but the static only got louder. Eventually, Magnus just cut the power altogether, but the crew still heard the whispers in their dreams. Sleep became a rare, fragile thing. Nightmares came for all of them, dreams of blue lights flickering in endless fog. Dreams of faces pressed to the portholes. Dreams of icy hands pulling them down into the black water. More than once, Magnus woke up gasping, heart pounding, convinced he was drowning. When Eric tried to throw himself overboard a second time, the crew started tying him to his bunk at night. He begged them to let him go, said he heard her calling, said if he didn't answer, they'd all be taken. The next day, they finally saw another ship, a Norwegian tanker. Massive and bright, slicing through the water like a promise of rescue. The crew of the Hildegard waved and shouted. Desperate for help, the tanker's captain responded, offering coordinates and company until they reached safer waters. But the moment the tanker drew close, its engines stuttered, its lights flickered, and the radio began to howl with static. The crew of the tanker called it a technical glitch and veered away. Keeping their distance, nobody would come close. By the time Lerwick's harbor came into view, the Hildegard looked like a ghost herself, grime-covered, battered, the crew pale and hollow-eyed. People on the docks stared as they limped in, whispering behind their hands. No one offered to help tie up the lines. Once ashore, Magnus filed a report, mechanical issues, rough seas, lost catch. He didn't mention the ghost ship, the blue lights, or the name written inside the oilskin coat. Who would believe him? Who would want to? Eric disappeared 2 days later, slipping out of his home in the middle of the night. His body was never found. The rest of the crew tried to move on, but strange things kept happening. Tomas heard voices in running water. Another man nearly drowned in his own bathtub. One by one, they grew withdrawn and fearful, haunted by the same nightmares. Magnus stayed up late every night, listening to the wind rattle his windows, the waves lapping at the stone breakwater. Some nights, when the fog rolled in thick, he swore he could see a blue light out beyond the harbor wall. And sometimes, just for a moment, a black ship drifting in the mist. When he finally slept, he dreamed of the Ægir's embrace, of cold hands and hollow eyes. And always, always that same voice, we'll be waiting, we'll be waiting, we'll be waiting, and he believed her. For a while, Magnus tried to keep to himself, sticking to familiar routines, fixing up his little house, walking the docks, drinking coffee in the same weather-beaten cafe every morning. But something in him had changed. Everything felt out of focus, shadows seemed too long. Every fog bank off the coast looked suspicious. And every time he passed a radio, his ears strained for that impossible, ghostly voice. Word spread around Lerwick. People noticed the Hildegard's crew, how they walked with hollow eyes, jumped at loud noises, and left the bar early, as if dreading the dark. Whispers followed them through the harbor. Did you hear what happened out there? Heard they saw something they shouldn't have. My uncle swears he saw blue lights out on the water last week. Magnus wanted to ignore it, but then the nightmares started infecting others. A fisherman from a neighboring trawler staggered into the cafe one morning, face white as milk, insisting he'd seen a ship with blue lights sailing through the fog. Didn't make a sound, he whispered. Was like she just slid past us. No wake, no crew, nothing but those lights. 2 dockworkers, tough guys who'd laughed at old ghost stories, quit their jobs and moved inland. One told Magnus, quietly, sometimes, late at night, I can hear knocking, like someone wants to come in from the sea. Magnus felt the town's paranoia growing. Local kids dared each other to sneak down to the shore on misty nights. Old men at the bar talked about ships lost decades ago. Stories that had seemed like superstition but now felt like warnings. Tomas, meanwhile, was unraveling. He stopped shaving, stopped showing up for work, started scribbling Norse runes on napkins and in the margins of newspapers. He told Magnus, there's a pattern to it, Captain, a cycle. Every generation, the ghost ship claims someone new. She's always hungry. Magnus wanted to deny it, but he kept seeing signs. The gulls avoided the docks. More than one local dog ran away and was later found drowned. A dense, unnatural fog rolled in night after night, swallowing the shore and all the boats in the harbor. Even the church bells sounded muffled, their chimes lost in the mist. One night, when Magnus couldn't sleep, he dug out an old maritime logbook and tried to retrace the Hildegard's path. As he charted their doomed course north by northeast, his pen slipped and landed on the same spot where, decades earlier, another trawler had vanished without a trace. His heart pounded as he flipped through local records, discovering that nearly every major fishing disaster off Lerwick's coast had started near that cursed stretch of sea. And always, in the survivors' stories, if there were any survivors, was the same detail. A ship with blue lights, gliding through the fog. Desperate for answers, Magnus tried to warn the harbor master, the Coast Guard, anyone who would listen. Most just shook their heads or laughed him off. "You've been at sea too long, Captain," one man said. "The fog does strange things to a man's mind." But that night, as Magnus walked home, the wind carried a sound he recognized instantly, a bell, ringing far out in the harbor, where no ship should be. He stopped and stared into the mist, heart pounding. A blue light winked on, then another, then a line of them, shimmering just above the water. Magnus stood frozen, unable to look away. He saw shapes moving on the deck of a shadowy vessel, figures waving, beckoning, faces both familiar and horribly empty. He backed away, stumbling, but the bell kept ringing, and the voice from his dreams whispered in the wind, "Don't look at the light. All hands lost. Join us." That was the moment Magnus understood. The curse of the Ægir's embrace was no longer just his burden. It was loose in the world now, spreading across the water, reaching for new souls, carried on every tide and every rolling bank of fog. And no one in Lerwick, not even those on dry land, was safe. The days grew shorter. The fog lingered long after sunrise, thick and impenetrable, curling around Lerwick like a living thing. For the first time in years, fishermen hesitated to set out before dawn. Parents kept their children close, warning them away from the harbor. Even the bars grew quiet at night, the usual laughter and music swallowed by a hush that felt heavy and unnatural. Stories spread faster than the tide. 2 local teens disappeared one foggy evening, last seen walking the old path along the breakwater. Their bikes were found abandoned near the edge of the rocks, tires pointing toward the water. Search parties scoured the coast for days, but all they found was a strip of oilskin, old, blackened, slick with salt, caught on a piece of driftwood. The rumor spread. The sea had claimed them for the ghost ship. Magnus watched it all with a sinking feeling of guilt and dread. He recognized the look in the parents' eyes, the disbelief, the desperate hope, the creeping certainty. It was the same expression he'd seen on the faces of his own crew after the Hildegard's nightmare voyage. The same horror that never left him. At night, the town was plagued by strange phenomena. Windows rattled with no wind. Dogs barked at empty doorways. Some people swore they saw blue lights drifting offshore, tiny, flickering beacons that moved against the current. More than one old sailor woke up screaming from dreams of icy water and faces pressed to the glass. Tomas finally snapped. He barged into Magnus's home late one night, wild-eyed, soaked with sweat, clutching a battered notebook filled with runes and warnings. "It's spreading," he whispered, voice shaking. "It's not just us, Captain. The ghost ship wants more. She's not satisfied." He told Magnus about the dreams he'd been having. Dreams of Lerwick drowned in fog, every house dark, every street flooded with seawater. Of the Ægir's embrace gliding through the main street, blue lights flickering, her crew reaching through windows and doors, pulling the living out into the mist. Magnus wanted to tell Tomas it was just trauma, just fear, but he couldn't. He'd seen too much himself. He'd started to believe the whole town was being watched, that something out on the water was counting every light in every window. Every soul brave enough to look back. The next evening, the church bells stopped ringing. The bell tower was found empty, the ropes swinging as if someone had just been there. No one saw the caretaker leave, but the dock hands swore they heard the echo of a bell out on the bay. Far after midnight, it was a kind of madness. but it was real. Magnus began keeping a lantern burning in his window every night, a week. Yellow glow to keep the blue lights at bay. He stopped sleeping, barely ate. When the fog crept in, he stood at his window, heart racing, watching for any sign of movement. Sometimes he saw it. A ripple in the water. A cold blue flash. A dark shape gliding by just below the surface. One night, as the fog curled around his home thicker than ever before, Magnus heard the voice again, clear, unmistakable, coming not from a dream or a radio, but from right outside his door. "Don't look at the light. We're waiting." He froze. The front step creaked as if someone, or something, was standing there. He wanted to scream, but the sound caught in his throat. Then, just as suddenly, the fog seemed to pull away, slipping back toward the sea, carrying the chill and the whispers with it. Magnus collapsed in his chair, shaking. The next morning, he learned that another boat had gone missing, an old friend. A lifelong sailor, vanished without a trace. No one wanted to talk about it, but everyone felt the same chill, the same dread. The curse was no longer just a tale told over drinks. The ghost ship was hunting now, calling to the lost, the lonely, the curious, and every night, as the fog rolled in, more and more people stared out into the dark, listening for a voice from the deep. Some of them even answered. It was the darkest night Lerwick had seen in years. The fog poured in thick and fast, swallowing the streets, muffling every sound. Houses became shadows, the harbor vanished, and even the church spire was lost in gray. There was no wind, only an eerie stillness, as if the world was holding its breath. Inside his little house, Magnus felt the pressure mounting. Each night, the fog pressed harder against the window. He barely recognized himself anymore, haggard, sleepless, nerves shot. His lantern guttered on the windowsill, but it felt pointless. The blue lights were out there, he could feel them, just waiting. Around midnight, the town bells tolled, except no one was ringing them. The sound rolled out over the rooftops, low and distorted, as if coming from underwater. Magnus's skin prickled. He knew, somehow, this was the night something would finally break. Down by the harbor, a group of townsfolk had gathered, some in raincoats and boots, others in pajamas, drawn like moths to the edge of the water by a fear they couldn't explain. Tomas was there too, wild-eyed, clutching his rune-scribbled notebook. "She's here," he said to no one in particular. "She's come for all of us." Magnus stumbled outside, following the sound of distant voices and the faint, unnatural glow pulsing through the mist. When he reached the docks, he saw them, blue lights, dozens of them, drifting along the water's surface like ghostly lanterns. They moved together, gliding closer, and behind them loomed the shape of a great ship, black and silent, impossibly tall in the fog. The Ægir's embrace. A chill ran through the crowd. No one spoke. The blue lights washed over their faces, casting deep shadows, making everyone look half dead already. Then, from the deck of the ghost ship, the woman in the tattered oilskin coat appeared again. Her face was pale as moonlight, her eyes bottomless and cold. She raised her arm, pointing at the crowd. The air filled with the sound of whispers, hundreds of voices overlapping, calling names, begging, promising peace. A few of the townsfolk began to move as if in a trance. Stepping forward, drawn to the water's edge, Tomas tried to hold them back, shouting, "Don't look, don't listen," but his voice was thin, lost in the swirl of voices. Magnus felt the pull too, deep, irresistible, like gravity. The blue lights seemed to press into his mind, filling his head with memories of the sea, of drowning, of emptiness. For a moment, he saw Eric standing at the rail, face hollow, lips moving in silent warning. The ship's bell rang out, deep and final. One by one, the blue lights bobbed and swayed, weaving closer to the shore. The water boiled where they touched, and dark, ghostly hands reached out from the waves. In the confusion, a woman screamed as her husband staggered toward the water. Eyes glazed, others tried to hold back loved ones, but the pull was too strong. The fog thickened, wrapping everyone in its cold embrace. Magnus, desperate, grabbed Tomas and shouted, "We have to stop this. There must be a way." But Tomas shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "She can't be stopped, Captain. She takes who she wants." More and more people vanished into the fog, their cries fading. The blue lights flashed and winked out, one by one, as if satisfied. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the ghost ship faded, swallowed by the mist. The harbor was silent again. The town empty and cold. Magnus dropped to his knees, trembling. All around him, the survivors stared at the water in shock, counting the missing, whispering names into the darkness. He knew the curse was far from over. The Ægir's embrace would return, as she always had, whenever the sea grew hungry, and the fog rolled in, and the living forgot to fear the deep. And somewhere out there, in the heart of the North Sea, the blue lights waited, always searching, always calling for more. The next morning, the fog was gone, burned away by a sharp wind blowing in from the east. Sunlight sparkled across Lerwick's harbor as if nothing terrible had happened. But the town was changed forever. Some houses stood empty, doors hung open, people wandered the streets in a daze, clutching photographs of the missing and asking questions that would never have answers. Magnus moved like a ghost through it all. His joints ached with exhaustion, and his mind replayed the night again and again, the blue lights, the bell, the faces lost to the mist. He tried to convince himself it was over, that the sea had claimed what it wanted and would leave Lerwick in peace. But deep down, he knew better. Tomas stopped talking altogether. He sat by the harbor every day, watching the horizon, scribbling runes on scraps of driftwood and tossing them into the tide. Some folks tried to leave town, but a few came right back, saying the road out seemed to disappear into an endless, swirling fog. Others refused to step foot near the water again. Within weeks, the fishermen who survived refused to fish the northern shoals. Boats were sold, nets were burned. More than one old trawler captain poured out a bottle of whiskey into the sea. Eyes wet with fear and respect, the legend spread, first through Lerwick, then out along the Shetland coast, then across the North Sea itself. They said the Ægir's embrace sailed where the living dared not go, calling to the lost and the lonely whenever the fog rolled in. They said if you ever heard a bell ringing in the mist, you should lock your doors and cover your mirrors. Never answer the whispers, never follow the lights, never look into the eyes of anyone who shouldn't be there. And always, always, leave an offering by the shore, just in case. Some said Magnus was never the same. He'd sit in his window at night, lantern burning low, eyes locked on the horizon. Sometimes, if you passed by just before dawn, you'd hear him talking softly to someone only he could see, offering warnings. Or maybe prayers, to the rolling deep. Others saw him walking the breakwater during the thickest fogs, watching for blue lights no one else dared to acknowledge. But most nights, the harbor was quiet, the wind howled, the waves slapped the stones, and the town tried to move on. The names of the lost faded, but the fear lingered when strangers asked about the empty homes or the old trawler rotting at her moorings. The locals only shook their heads. It's just the North Sea, they'd say. She always takes what she's owed. And out beyond the breakers, on certain misty nights, those who listened closely swore they could still hear the distant ringing of a ship's bell and see faint blue lights flickering far from shore. Somewhere, the Ægir's embrace was still sailing. The legend lived on, passed down from one frightened voice to the next, a warning whispered over mugs of coffee or late-night whiskey in Lerwick's bars. Beware the fog, beware the lights, and never, ever answer the call from the sea. Thank you so much for listening all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this video, please give Hidden Nightmares X a like, share, leave a comment, and don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you'll be the first to know when a new video drops.